Hello everyone and welcome back to the Northumbrian podcast. Today I will be reviewing the new 6th season of Black Mirror. Now the new series has been long awaited by Mirrorheads, which is a name for fans of the show which I just invented. I assume since you're watching this video now then you are familiar with the premise of the show, but for those that aren't, Black Mirror is essentially a glimpse into a nightmarish dystopian world of horrors beyond our imagination. Thankfully not beyond the imagination of series creator Charlie Brooker and his team of writers. Now, I've been a fan of Black Mirror for almost a decade now. Wow, I feel old. My introduction to the show was the unforgettable episode White Bear. I remember watching it with no prior understanding of the Black Mirror ethos and thinking it was just a straightforward damsel in distress survival situation, and then the dark twist at the end was like nothing I'd ever seen on British television before. Yes, there have been TV shows with ironic and surprising plot twists like, The Twilight Zone and Tales of the Unexpected, but I'd never seen such a taboo topic used as a plot device like in White Bear. So Black Mirror has been on our screens for 12 years now. Wow, the time has flown by, and some people seem to think that it's past its prime and maybe Charlie Brooker should throw in the towel and quit while he's ahead, but I think this new series still has some of the old dark magic of the early seasons, and in this video I'm going to explain why. And of course I will be discussing the episodes in detail, so beware of spoilers. So the first episode is called Joan is Awful. Now, I personally felt that this was actually the weakest episode of the new series. Black Mirror usually has, one silly humorous episode per season, like Nosedive or The Waldo Moment, and this was certainly it. The episode begins by showing the humdrum life of an HR manager named Joan, who was given the awkward task of firing a long-time employee. After that awkward encounter, she then meets her ex-boyfriend for drinks, where the two share a kiss before Joan regretfully leaves. She then goes home to her fiancé, where the two settle in for an evening watching the TV and discover a new streaming app called Streamberry, which is of course a fictional representation of Netflix. On Streamberry, they discover a new series called Joan is Awful, which turns out to be a near exact retelling of her day, starring none other than Selma Hayek, who is sporting the same clothes and hairstyle as the eponymous Joan. Seeing the exact events of her day retold on the screen is unsettling enough to begin with, but the real trouble begins when the TV show reveals to her fiancé that Joan visited a bar to reconnect with her ex. Upset by the betrayal, her fiancé leaves her, and the following day Joan is fired from her job. Enraged, she visits a lawyer who informs her that there is nothing they can do because Joan technically consented to give Streamberry all rights to her image when she agreed to the terms and conditions. The lawyer remarks that Joan probably never reads the terms and conditions, which is something I'm sure we're all guilty of. Joan also learns that the star of the show is not really Selma Hayek, but a CGI likeness. Believing that Selma Hayek may have the power to stop the show's production, Joan decides to grab the Hollywood A-listers' attention by dressing in a cheerleader outfit, bursting into a church in the middle of a wedding, and squirting hot diarrhea all over the place. Knowing full well that the same bizarre incident would inevitably be portrayed on screen by Selma Hayek's likeness. Naturally, of course, Miss Hayek objects and visits the main character at home to express her displeasure at being seen defecating in a church, which, as a proud Roman Catholic, she finds deeply offensive. Now, at this point in the episode, I actually stopped and thought for a brief moment, is this really Selma Hayek on screen, or have they made a CGI representation of her, which is a testament to the disassociating effect of the show on an impressionable viewer like me. But no, of course, it is really Selma Hayek being portrayed on screen. So Selma Hayek joins the protagonist on a quest to bring down the computer, intentional mispronunciation there, which is the main system responsible for generating the CGI episodes. Joan and Salma infiltrate Streambury headquarters and reach the server room, where they discover none other than Michael Cera, who plays a technician. Now, before watching this episode, if you'd ask me to guess which Hollywood actors would appear in the new series of Black Mirror, I never in a million years would have guessed Michael Cera. I remember when this show was filled with no-name British actors. Now, when Michael Cera, as the control room operator, fails to help the women, Joan knocks him unconscious with a punch. Apparently, according to an interview with the Superbad star, this scene was not rehearsed. He was only on set for like 2 days, but he reportedly enjoyed the experience of being knocked out by Annie Murphy. Who wouldn't? The episode ends with the main character discovering that she herself is actually living in a fictional layer of reality and is merely one of many Joans, and not even the original one. The original Joan then destroys the quantum computer, and in the final scene, the original Joan is shown running a coffee shop where she's visited by the Joan played by Annie Murphy. Now, if you haven't seen the episode yet, that probably sounded like double Dutch, and it was quite a complex ending. But as Hitchcock said, an audience would rather be confused than bored. I was surprised to see Charlie Brooker take such a scathing swipe at Netflix. To me, it seems like biting the hand that feeds you, considering how much money he probably got from them. But I suppose any publicity is good publicity. And I've just realised that in my write-up of this episode, I've alternatingly spelt Selma and Salma 2 different ways, and I've just used them interchangeably, so apologies, I don't know which one it actually is. Joan is Awful is about as meta as it gets, exploring themes of privacy, advanced AI, and who really owns the rights to our image. I'm sure we'll all be reading the terms and conditions a little more carefully after watching this episode. Leaving the light-hearted silliness of episode 1 behind, we venture into the Celtic Darkness of episode 2, Loch Henry. The episode begins with a young man named Davis, who hails from a remote Scottish village, who has been away, I assume down London, studying film, and he brings his young African-American girlfriend Pia back to his home village, intending to make a documentary about a local egg collector. The two visit an empty pub owned by Davis's childhood friend Stuart, who explains why the pub and the village is empty by telling Pia the story of local murderer Ian Adair, who tortured and murdered tourists back in the 1990s. Davis's father Kenneth, a policeman, was also shot by the killer as he attempted to arrest him, which led to his death in hospital from an MRSA infection. Adair then killed his family and himself with a shotgun. The murders were so shocking that tourists stopped visiting the village. I actually found this to be a fairly unrealistic plot point. If anything, a notorious murder case will bring more visitors. And when Stewart encourages them to make a documentary to bring the murders back into the public consciousness, that surely contradicts the notion that the notoriety is what scared the tourists away in the first place. So anyway, Pia is fascinated by the story and wants to make a documentary about Adair and the murders. So when I first heard that name, Adair, the first thing I thought was Mad Dog Adair, who I know he was from Northern Ireland, but it's not a very common name, and he was a notorious killer of sorts back in the 90s, albeit in a paramilitary setting. So I wondered if the naming was intentional. Another thing that sprang to mind was Dunblane, an unfathomably horrific crime that took place in a Scottish village in 1996, which was pretty much the exact time as the events portrayed in the episode. It could just be a coincidence, but it was the first thing that jumped to my mind watching this. So the couple returned to Davis's childhood home and meet his mother. Now, at this point, we get quite unsettling vibes from Davis's mother, which I initially thought it's because his girlfriend is black, and that might offend her old world rural views. But of course, there is a much darker truth. as we find out later in the episode. Excuse me 1 second. Try to take a sip of water there. So I found the Monica Dolan's variation of a Scottish accent interesting. Monica Dolan plays the mother. And I googled her, and it turns out she's actually from Middlesbrough, not far from me. So I would be interested to hear from any Scottish viewers about whether Monica Dolan's accent playing Janet was authentic or not, whether it was authentically Highland, because I can't tell. Funnily enough, Monica Dolan actually played Rose West in a TV crime drama, which turns out to be very ironic as the episode goes on. So Janet welcomes the couple, and the pair begin taping the documentary using old cassettes of Bergerac, which was Janet's favourite show. Davis and Pia decide to break into Adair's abandoned home, where they explore and film the basement torture dungeon for their documentary. On the drive home, they end up in a crash which puts Davis in hospital. And while Davis is recovering from his injuries in hospital, Pia discovers that Janet's Bergerac tapes actually contain a horrifying recording of Ian Adair's brutal murders, in which he is assisted by none other than Davis's parents, Janet and Kenneth, who was the police officer. Now, for any British viewers, this probably calls to mind the crimes of Fred and Rose West. As I mentioned before, the actress who plays Janet in this episode actually won a BAFTA for playing Rose West in a crime drama called Appropriate Adult. So Pia, now that Pia knows the horrible truth about Davis's mother, she tries to flee the house, desperately trying to contact Davis on the phone. Janet, the mother, realizes that Pia has made this shocking discovery, so Janet chases Pia down in her car, and as Pia flees, she falls into a fast-flowing river and dies. Janet then hangs herself. Fast forward to the documentary being launched on the streaming service, Streambury. The film becomes a smash hit that wins a BAFTA and brings newfound attention and tourists to the town of Lochhenry. Davis, however, remains traumatized by the experience and returns to his hotel alone after the BAFTA ceremony, where he reads his mother's final note, "For your film, Mum." Now, at the BAFTA Awards, portrayed on screen, I noticed one of the documentaries they were up against was called Euthanasia, the Junipero Project, which is a reference to episode San Junipero, probably one of my favourite episodes. There are loads and loads of those little Easter eggs in virtually every episode of Black Mirror, and there are dedicated videos on YouTube where you can count them all. So in Lochhenry, Charlie Brooker wanted to explore the fetishization of old media, namely VHS cassette tapes. Now, people of my vintage might remember going to Blockbuster and renting one of these VHS tapes or videos. It's interesting the way people fetishize old media. It started with vinyl LP records, but now it seems that with the passage of time, people are starting to look back with nostalgia at VHS cassette tapes. I actually still have some VHS tapes, Jurassic Park, The Land Before Time, Short Circuit, Rambo, so I think I'll hang on to them in case they're worth something. One thing I did wonder is why the mother in this episode just left the videotapes out in the open for someone to find. It seems a bit of an irrational thing to do, unless she wanted to get caught. Now, the reference to videotape also reminded me of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. They used an audio tape recorder to record the sounds of their unholy torture and killing, so it could be a reference to that too. This was apparently the first episode of Black Mirror set in Scotland. According to Charlie Brooker, Scotland has an unsentimental strand of humour that the episode tried to draw on. I think that's true. I think that Scots do have a really grim, sardonic sense of humour, which lends itself to this kind of dark horror. I think Scottish people also have the capacity to be quite menacing. Now that's not a quote from Charlie Brooker, that's a quote from me, someone who's born and raised 70 miles from the Scottish border, and has had to deal with Scots in a professional and personal capacity. They do have this menacing quality that most English people lack, which lends itself well to horror, I think. The episode was filmed near Loch Lomond, so the landscape shots are very scenic. It's a beautiful part of the world if you ever have the chance to visit up there. Although the whole episode seems imbued with a kind of dark filter, which of course suits the mood of the episode. So in summary, I think this was an excellent episode, which felt very much like a return to the morbid gallows humour that epitomised Black Mirror's early seasons, and no one exemplifies that better than the Scots, of course. I feel like this episode is a rebuttal to all the naysayers who claim that Black Mirror should have ended years ago. Here we have a strong episode which will remain in viewers' memories for a good wee while. So moving to episode 3, we journey from the Scottish lochs to the far reaches of outer space. On the face of it, Beyond the Sea seems to be set in the 1960s, but being Black Mirror, this is an alternate universe version of the 60s where the fashions are much the same, but the technology is advanced enough to allow humans to simultaneously explore deep space and also exist in a robotic avatar on Earth. So 2 astronauts, David and Cliff, are 2 years into a 6-year deep space mission. They spend their days working on the spacecraft, and when they go to sleep at night, they then inhabit their earthly robotic avatar and spend time with their respective wives and families. As the men go about their daily lives on Earth, people often approach them with a kind of fascinated awe, which indicates that this must be a fairly new, novel technology. I couldn't help but notice the dissonance between the technology that would allow a human in the far reaches of deep space to inhabit a perfect replica on Earth compared to the tiny black and white television screen. But I don't think the creators were aiming for realism. They just like the 1960s aesthetic, and there is something very cool about the 60s aesthetic. However, David soon encounters a very dark aspect of the real 1960s, which was of course murderous hippies. Clearly based on the Manson family, a band of hippies break into his house and murder his wife and children while also destroying his replica. These hippies claim to be motivated by an ethos that opposes anything unnatural. Their problem with David was that his avatar was somehow in opposition to nature. Now, for the viewer, there was quite an uncomfortable cognitive dissonance here, at least for me, as I felt compelled to acknowledge that these deranged killers had a point. There is something uncanny and unnatural about the replicas, and the families, by living with the replicas, almost become complicit in this unnaturalness. Following the horrific murder of his family, David understandably becomes despondent. So Cliff, after a discussion with his wife Lana, agrees to let David use his replica to visit Earth, just to allow him to feel the sun and the wind again. David is delighted with his visit and longs to return. After he offers to paint a landscape of Cliff's house, David was established as a painter and artist at the start of the episode. Cliff allows him to return and use his avatar to visit Earth. Predictably, this leads to a blossoming friendship between the sensitive artist David and the neglected wife Lana. I did wonder if she was named after Lana Del Rey, because Lana Del Rey has this kind of like 60s Americana aesthetic, maybe. So David, inhabiting Cliff's body, so to speak, grows close to Cliff's wife until finally making advances towards her, which are rebuffed. Cliff is furious when he finds out and angrily remonstrates with David, telling him in insulting terms that Lana is not interested. Feeling rejected and humiliated, David lures Cliff outside the spacecraft with the pretense of emergency repairs. Now, at this point, I thought that he was just going to shut the doors, abandon Cliff, and just leave him in space to die, while he surreptitiously inhabits Cliff's body and returns to his wife. But that's not what he does. He jumps into Cliff's replica and butchers Cliff's wife and child. When Cliff discovers that the fault report was a false alarm and returns to the ship, he immediately senses that something is wrong. He runs back to his avatar, returns to his home, and in a shocking scene finds his hands covered in blood and his family butchered. He returns to the ship incandescent with rage. Now my first thought was, why doesn't he just kill the guy? Surely that would be the instinctive reaction towards a person who has just annihilated your family. But then I remembered that the spacecraft requires 2 men to operate it, so Cliff had no choice but to join David at the table for what would surely be an incredibly awkward 4-year space journey. In my opinion, Beyond the Sea was a fantastic episode. True to the spirit of the early seasons, it explores the idea of the real self versus the digital self. David was inhabiting Cliff's digital self, yet his digital self was more real because it lived alongside his real family. This also begs the question, a plot question, why didn't NASA just send the replicas up into space and let the actual real astronauts just continue living their lives on Earth? The short answer, because then there wouldn't be much of a plot. Although thinking pragmatically, if you sent the replicas up into space and something went wrong, there's no one human there to fix them. Although something did malfunction up there, it just happened to be the astronaut's brain. The aesthetics of the episode are of course fabulous, from the 60s fashion to the high-tech spacecraft to the quaint country house, all set to a background of the delightful chanson classique La Mer by Charles Trenet, otherwise known as Beyond the Sea in the English-speaking world. The astronauts are obviously far beyond the sea. Charlie Brooker always makes good use of music, particularly when he pairs a really light-hearted melody with a really grim moment on screen. So moving forward, episode 4. Episode 4 is called Maisie Day, which is a reference to the eponymous character. It centers around a paparazzi photographer trying to get pictures of the eponymous actress. Now this episode started quite slow, so slow in fact that I began to get distracted and start looking at my phone, even though I'm supposed to be paying attention so I can do this video. I didn't realize at first that the setting for this episode was actually the mid-2000s, I think around 2006. I didn't realize until I noticed that the phone that the main character was using was quite dated. It was like an old type phone. Now, when something is set in the 60s or 70s, you can instantly tell by the fashion or the cars, but even though the 2000s was 2 decades ago, it didn't visually look that different from today, apart from, of course, the cell phones and digital tech, which is what gave away the time setting. The reason for setting it in the mid-2000s is because the main character is a paparazzi, which back then was a lucrative career for the morally flexible, but you did need a good camera. Nowadays, of course, with modern smartphones, anyone can be a paparazzi, if they happen to run across a celebrity, that is. So the actor that she was photographing calls her an animal, which is some classic foreshadowing. Now later on, obviously, when the paparazzi reach the place where Maisie is, she's undergoing the agonies of transforming into a werewolf, and the group of paparazzi begin taking photographs, which does, of course, beg the age-old question, who is the real monster? At the end, when Bo stands over Maisie and films her suicide with the cop's gun, this seems to be a scathing critique on how the media will gleefully exult in a public figure's self-destruction. To give a current example, look at what's happening to Bam Margera. I know he's not exactly an A-lister these days, but the popular social media sites, they seem to be capitalizing on his sad spiral. This episode, I found, it was a fairly weak episode. I think it was far too slow, and I think that the ending was a tad predictable. I didn't think there was much there plot-wise, so I didn't rate Maisie Days very much. So the 5th and final episode is called Demon 79. The main character is called Nita Hook, which may be a reference to Charlie Brooker's wife, Connie Hook. Is a sales assistant at a department store and faces discrimination and racism from her co-workers and boss. In the store's basement, she discovers a talisman that unleashes a demon in training named Garp. Garp, dressed as the lead singer of Boney M, tells Nita to kill 3 people in the next few days to prevent the threat of nuclear apocalypse. Apparently, Garp is apparently the name of a real demon from an actual ancient grimoire, which is interesting. Now, I think this episode was an interesting premise with a lot of potential that was poorly executed, no pun intended. The demon taking the form of Bobby Farrell from Boney M was kind of amusing at first, but I think Charlie Brooker's original idea, which was portraying the demon as a kind of National Front skinhead, that would have actually had much more gravitas and meaning, because it would have been horrifying for someone like Nita for obvious reasons. Maybe they could have had a scene where the demon tries various different forms, and the Boney M could have been one of them that he tries at first, which would have worked as like a one-time joke. I think the episode dragged on a little too long, and the plot was too linear and straightforward. There were no plot twists or surprises, which I look forward to in a show like Black Mirror. They could have maybe done more with the whole MP Michael Smart as a demon angle. Aside from the demonic apocalyptic storyline, it was also a very political tale. Charlie Brooker makes no secret of his political views. The Tory MP was obviously a very thinly veiled avatar for Enoch Powell, who, if he had been able to get into power, would have taken the country in a very different direction, as shown by the brief clip of the mechanical dogs from Metalhead. Nita tries to kill the MP, which has unfortunate undertones after the recent murder of 2 MPs in Britain in recent years. But it's nevertheless presented as a kind of virtuous assassination in light of this particular MP, being an almost demonic demagogue. Now, this episode portrayed the experience of a British Asian in the 1970s north of England. The workplace microaggressions, the comments about the food she's eating at lunch, the spray painted NF on the door for National Front. This was all the daily reality for Indian and Pakistani people at the time, and the sort of dark, fearful atmosphere of the episode could be a reflection of the climate of fear that Asian people might have felt at the time in England. Now, Black Mirror aside, I've always been fascinated by the British Asian experience, and I'd love to see a film or maybe drama series about that. So the Armageddon ending was obviously spelled out by the demon at the start of the episode, but at the same time, I didn't expect the writers to actually go with it. I assumed the protagonist would somehow avert the crisis. As the police officer watches the bombs fall, he says, "They've bloody well done it," which I seem to remember is a line said by a similar character in the film Threads. If you've never seen Threads, it's a British film about a nuclear apocalypse. Probably one of the most horrifying movies ever made. It's not for the faint of heart. But if you do get the chance to watch it, I do recommend it if you like that sort of thing. Personally, I think the apocalypse never actually happened and Nita was just hallucinating. That's one theory I've read online. I feel like the literal apocalypse was just too obvious as an ending. So in summary, I feel like this new series of Black Mirror was better than I expected. I went in with quite low expectations after the previous series. The first episode, Joan is Awful, was light-hearted, vaguely amusing, but ultimately quite insipid and forgettable. Episode 2, Loch Henry, was brilliant, dark comedy, worthy of the early series. Episode 3, again, I thought it was brilliant, kind of future nostalgia, definitely worthy of a place in the early series. Episode 4, Maisie Days, quite weak, quite forgettable, I think, just filler. And episode 5, it had a lot of potential, but I think it went on too long, and I think it had a lot of potential which was mishandled, and it could have been a lot better. But yeah, all in all, the new series of Black Mirror was quite good. If you haven't seen it yet, I recommend it. And I think, is there going to be a series 7? I think there is still potential for a 7th series, and I look forward to watching it. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for joining. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and until next time, goodbye.